Hello everybody. Before you watch this video, I must explain that the interview you're about to see was recorded back in February, right at the start of the media pile on me. Since many of the early attacks misrepresented my view on domestic violence, we decided this wasn't the time to release this and allow this important issue to be caught up in the mudslinging. But just one point of clarification. You're going to hear me discuss with my guest the demise of the dreadful White Ribbon domestic violence organisation, which had been declared bankrupt late last year. Sadly, it's now back in operation, spreading misinformation and anti-male propaganda in schools and workplaces across the country. Now, on with the interview. There's a lot of concern in Australia about violence in Indigenous communities, and particularly the vulnerability of children and women who are living with violent men. But what we never hear about are violent Indigenous women. And I have with me today someone who knows a lot about this whole issue, Phillip Bligh. Very nice to have you here, Phillip.
Well, thanks, Bettina, for inviting me to join you. It's a privilege.
Phillip is an Indigenous leader living up on the Central Coast, just north of Sydney. And he's done a lot of work in Indigenous communities, consulting work. Tell me a bit about your background.
Well, I worked in government previously, in state government and also federal government, and I had the opportunity in my role to visit a lot of Aboriginal communities, particularly around New South Wales and in outback New South Wales, in fairly remote communities. And with the federal government, I was able to visit communities outside, Aboriginal communities outside Australia. Not outside Australia, outside New South Wales. You came to me, you contacted me because you knew about the work I've been doing to get a broader, truer picture of what's happening in domestic violence, and you wrote to me about the fact that you'd been asked to review a White Ribbon training manual and in relation to what's happening in Indigenous communities. Now, for people who don't know about White Ribbon, particularly people overseas, White Ribbon is a virtue signalling organisation. It's about getting men to stand up, addressing violence against women, men, and it's an organisation which has ended up being declared bankrupt last year for spending all their money, which we were delighted about. I mean, it's a very dangerous organisation in my view because it's promoting the notion that only men are violent, and that was always the theme. So you're presented with this training manual. Tell me about that. Well, I had exactly the same concerns, that the narrative depicted men as being the only perpetrators of violence in Aboriginal communities, well, across the board really, and that was not true with what I knew about what was happening in Aboriginal communities. It was certainly two ways violence, and also their reason for, you know, what caused the violence was, I thought, absolutely wrong, way off the mark. Yeah, I mean, it was also, the explanation for violence is always this patriarchal society, misogynist male attitudes. Is that what they would say? That's right. Well, it didn't align with what was happening in our Aboriginal communities. And, you know, I challenged that view with White Ribbon. I actually sat around the boardroom table with senior staff of White Ribbon and also members of the diversity panel from around Australia, and you know, aired my views with them, and yeah, they didn't really receive that too well, I don't think. I can imagine that. Before we go any further, I just want to show you some of the statistics to reveal the real picture about Indigenous violence. It's not easy to find any data about Aboriginal women's violence. It's quite remarkable how many academic papers on Indigenous violence simply don't mention violent women. The one official organisation that doesn't shy away from non-PC topics is the outstanding New South Wales Bureau of Crime Statistics and Research, which has dug out their latest data for us, revealing some remarkable figures.
Here we can see a graph giving the latest 2019 figures showing offender rates for domestic violence assaults, comparing male and female Indigenous and general populations per 100,000. The red bars represent the Aboriginal population and the grey ones the group of all men and women. Now see the huge red bar on the right. This represents the high rates of domestic violence in Aboriginal men, towering over the grey one showing domestic violence in the general population of males. But on the left you can see the red bar for Aboriginal women, who are far more violent not only than the group of all women, but also the bar representing all men. The data shows Indigenous women are 8 times more likely to be perpetrators of domestic violence than women in general. And Aboriginal women are more than twice as violent as men in general. See here the 2019 comparison of these two groups. Indigenous women also show the greatest growth in domestic violence perpetrator rates over the last decade. Have a look at this graph comparing 2010 figures to the 2019 rates. You'll see that women are becoming more violent. Look at the small bars at the top of the graph showing the changing rates over the last decade for all women. The bottom 2019 grey bar is significantly larger than the top red 2010 one. Go a little further down and you'll see that the domestic violence rates for all men are decreasing. So the red bar for the 2010 figure is larger than the grey bar for the 2019 group. You don't hear much about that, do you? No one dares trumpet this good news because it might result in a hit to the huge domestic violence industry's favourite cash cow that helps keep the whole feminist enterprise in business. Moving further down the graph, you'll find the Aboriginal women. Here you can see a major leap in rates of violence over the last decade, comparing the smaller red bar for 2010 to the significantly larger grey bar for 2019 below. And finally, at the very bottom, there's the Aboriginal males. And here too we see a decline, contrary to the popular narrative. It's good to see some tiny drop in their frightening levels of violence. Now back to our discussion.
One of the other things you mentioned to me is the impact on Indigenous men, particularly young men, growing up in this society where they're being demonised, where the violence is blamed entirely on them. And they know that's not the truth. What's this doing to boys in your community?
Well, I really think that there's a number of things operating here, and I really, when I look back at people in Aboriginal communities, when I was growing up, we defined our masculinity by our physicality.
Yeah.
You know, we were very physical. We played lots of sports and grew up in a small town, Byrook, which was near Burke in New South Wales,
yeah.
way out west, until I was about 8, and then we moved to Burke. But look, there was no sort of crime that I was sort of really aware of with the young fellas who were actively involved in sport and really being physical.
It's probably toxic masculinity, you know.
Well, this was one of the things that I was really wrestling with, this idea of toxic masculinity, because you know, this whole thing that you know, you have to stop boys from being, you know, physical, I think was really damaging to our Aboriginal young men. And
so you think there's been a big change from when you were growing up to what young men are being taught now?
Well, I think so, because you know, if you look at you know, my father's generation and the generation of my older brothers and myself, you know, we played lots of sports. You know, we played rugby league, there was boxing and all those sort of physical sports. You know, cricket and tennis and things like that. And but now, you know, we're sort of, our young boys stop from playing, you know, physical games in schools.
Yeah.
And you know,
I mean, did you look at what's happening? I know you're doing some work in schools now. I mean, what do you think that the whole feminist narrative about teaching boys not to be violent is being promoted there in schools? Do you see sign of that?
Well, that was part of the White Ribbon strategy.
Yeah, and they
were actually delivering workshops into the schools and telling the boys that their masculinity was toxic.
Yeah. That
they were basically these, you know, monsters in waiting, and you know, they were forced to stand up and you know, tell the they were forced to stand up and deliver
apologise for their
apologise and say the White Ribbon Oath.
Yeah.
That they would not, you know, hurt.
Acknowledge their violence.
Yeah, acknowledge their violence.
But it's about shaming
wouldn't
men.
hit women. Yeah, it was a real shaming thing for particularly for Aboriginal young boys.
Tell me what you know about Indigenous communities. You talked about two-way violence. So in violent families, you're often seeing violent women as well as men. Is that what you've observed?
Well, of course.
Yeah.
And I think it's fairly evenly spread amongst the male and the females. And but one of my major concerns was the fact that they lay the blame at the foot of patriarchal attitudes and male dominance.
Yeah.
And that wasn't true in Aboriginal communities, and I thought that we really needed to do a proper diagnosis of what was actually happening in Aboriginal communities, and that was completely absent.
Tell me about some of the families you've observed. What is actually going on? The violent families. You've seen men who are victims of violence.
Well, I've seen men who are victims of violence. I've seen women who are victims of violence. And I've also witnessed that violence is not evenly spread across Aboriginal communities. Yeah. In some areas there's little evidence of violence, and in other areas it's quite bad.
Yeah.
I think this is as a result of the trauma from the impact of colonisation, which is tracked down through the generations. Mm-hmm. So I actually have seen women beating up on the men.
Yeah.
And I've seen men retaliating, and I've seen men actually putting up with abuse from women for long periods of time as well.
You've talked to me about what happens to a bloke who, where there is violence, who's dealing with a violent woman, the police get called. What happens to him?
Well, in the process of actually reviewing the White Ribbon Trainer's Manual, I was talking to people, particularly men on the Central Coast where I live, and one particular case came to my notice where there was a young fellow who was had a history of abuse from his mother, mm-hmm. and this abuse actually started before he was became of age. He was only, before he was a teenager, and he started to push back in his later years, and
when she was physically violent or just emotionally violent towards him?
Emotionally violent, it was assault on his character and his self-esteem and confidence, and it was a history of that, and there was evidence of that.
Yeah.
And but there was a time when she actually there was an argument in the house, and there was a bit of pushing, and she reported the incident to the police, and they threw the book at him.
Yeah.
And when I saw the charges and the evidence in front of me, it was quite, and heard his story, it was quite evident that the charges were trumped up.
Yeah. And you, in that case and in other cases, police have said to you that this is the way the narrative has to run. I mean, they're under a lot of pressure, the police, to only believe the man, only believe the woman. Yeah,
well, I actually had the opportunity to talk to police as well, and they expressed to me that men were left out of the equation altogether.
Yeah.
And I told them that I was reviewing the White Ribbon Trainer's Manual, and one of the female police said to me, "Can you do something about men?"
Meaning male perpetrators, male victims. Yeah.
Yeah. Can you do something for men?
Yeah.
And you know, as I was going through this whole process, it was really alarming. I was actually quite disturbed about the whole thing and how it was playing out in Aboriginal communities.
Yeah.
Because I know that the Aboriginal men that I was talking to, and this wasn't just one story, it was really consistent, and they were saying that there were young Aboriginal men who were pleading guilty to charges because that was the easy way out. So they were left with these...
And they've got no money, no one defending them, nothing.
Well, on the Central Coast, there is actually no Aboriginal legal service.
Yeah.
And you don't, if it's a domestic violence charge, you don't get any assistance from public legal officers either.
Yeah, but so, it's true. I mean, I'm sure if you look at the Aboriginal legal services throughout Australia, I don't imagine they do much defending men in these situations. I mean, I presume most of the time the money would go toward defending the females and believing the women.
Well, I'm not quite sure about that, but I think the response is to men that you're not going to jail, so you don't qualify for any legal aid.
Yeah.
So, you know, they either have to go in and plead guilty without any representation at all, or get representation, and that costs them a lot of money.
Yeah. It is a complex problem, because one of the things you talked to me about was, I think in the case you've just mentioned, there was a problem of mental illness in the woman, in the perpetrator, the woman. And of course, one of the things that emerges very strongly in some of these dysfunctional communities is alcohol problems, drug and alcohol problems. And so it's this complexity of mental illness, drug and alcohol, all these other factors, which all the international research shows to be part of the problem of domestic violence, and yet our entire domestic violence industry is pushing the notion that it's just about male attitudes, just about patriarchy. They buy into the feminist narrative and deny the truth about what's going on here.
Absolutely, you know, there's a total dismissal of the truth.
Yeah.
And I was baffled as to why White Ribbon Australia was actually pushing this feminist narrative. The more I looked into it, the more concerned I became, and the more I found how this was impacting negatively on Aboriginal people and in our communities. To give you an example of what I'm saying, the case that I was privy to on the Central Coast, there was a situation where, you know, the mother was the perpetrator of violence, and the young fellow was charged. But when it came to the court, the solicitors, you know, actually advised him to get anger management and will go to undertake an anger management course. And you know, so...
Yes, they're advised that as a strategy. As a strategy,
yeah.
But when they go in, of course, they're told you have to accept that you're the perpetrator.
That's right. So, you know, you have this situation where you have this person who is really not a violent person going, undertaking a violent anger management course, and then the female who has a mental illness is just completely ignored. So she doesn't get the treatment that she needs as well.
And of course, this boy grew up with this violent mother, and that is what's happening in our Indigenous communities. Children are growing up witnessing violence, not just from their fathers, but from their mothers as well. We are denying that. So, and the cycle continues. That is one of the key factors in perpetuating violence throughout the community, is witnessing violence in your home. And we're ignoring at least half of the problem, aren't we, here?
Yeah, well, you know, we're really ignoring the fact that it's two ways.
Yeah.
And then, you know, we're not sort of looking into it properly and giving it the attention that it really deserves.
I mean, the other aspect of that, of course, is mothers still tended to be the main carers of children. And when you have a woman who's half pissed all the time, you know, the major alcohol problems, you get massive amounts of child neglect. And that is what emerged. If you look at the figures in the Indigenous communities of neglected children, they're just extraordinary.
Well, there's a lot of father absence now for lots of different reasons.
Yeah.
And that's, the situation is compounded by, both parents having alcohol and or drug problems.
Yeah.
And, that's all the children know growing up, and they witness the, when you're living in a pressure cooker situation,
yeah.
something's bound to give.
Yeah.
And, there's a lot of push and shove and argy-bargy, and this is played out, and this is what children witness. And the way domestic violence is defined these days, it's very broad.
Yeah.
So there's in that
the
sense,
emotional abuse should be in there. Well, we can't have it. If we're going to talk about emotional abuse, it should apply both ways, and it doesn't. That we rarely properly acknowledge the problems for males of being emotionally abused.
Well, in my review of the White Ribbon Trainer's Manual, I actually looked into a remote Aboriginal community up in the Northern Territory, Gulawinku, and did a case study on that. And I looked at the way two different women framed the domestic violence problem up there.
Yeah.
We had a lady from the ABC who framed it in a way that actually fit the feminist narrative really neatly.
What a surprise, yes.
And then we had another lady who actually, a white lady who had actually lived in the community and who was adopted into the community. She had lived there for at least 7 years.
Yeah.
And had a completely different take on the situation. And
she understood the sort of issues we're talking about.
Yeah. She had a better understanding of those issues, and because I think that any prevention strategy needs to take into account those cultural sensitivities, but also the based on the impact of what colonisation has done to Aboriginal people as well. And it's got to be, a truthful, honest approach.
Yeah, but not leaving this glaring gap, which we're allowed to acknowledge. When you started going out and talking about this, I know you went and talked to friends of yours, other people in the Indigenous community, to check out whether your feelings in relation to the White Ribbon Manual were shared by others, and you found a lot of people knew exactly what you were talking about but didn't want to talk publicly about it.
Well, they actually, privately, a lot of particularly the men, I spoke to a lot of men, and they were agreeing with me in private with what I was saying, and but when it came to publicly, they sort of shied away from it.
We tried to get a few more Indigenous leaders here today, and you were the only one brave enough in the end, Phil.
Well, it's a bit of a risk to a man, I think, when you step forward and enter into this debate.
Yeah.
I always take the attitude that, these things ought to be discussed openly and honestly, and that we should have a mature and sensible discussion about it. But for some reason, we're closed down, and if you have a certain attitude or a view, then you can be labelled.
Yeah.
And that can be sort of really detrimental to, your career or what you're standing in the community.
Yeah.
And I think that this is the fear that a lot of men have.
Yeah. One of the things you've mentioned is now, so we've got this traditional Indigenous culture, and that is being blamed for some of this now, isn't it? The whole idea that there are customs, there are attitudes in the traditional Indigenous world, if you like, which are partly responsible for this violence towards women. Tell me about how that all comes together.
Well, I have really, grave concerns about that, because prior to colonisation, we had, customary law that served our people for thousands of years, served us really well. And, there are some communities in Australia that still hang on to that customary law. And there are elements of that customary law that could be considered as being quite, harsh and violent. And I don't think that ought to be conflated with, the real domestic violence. So
But you did say to me, sometimes men, for instance, can use that, this is part of our customary law, as an excuse for perpetrating violence. That is part of this complex picture, isn't it?
I think so, because there are parts of Australia that practice the customary law in a genuine way, but I suspect that there are also Aboriginal men that use the customary law as an excuse to commit violent acts. And that should be clearly understood.
Overall, you're saying that it's a very complex picture, the way customary law is influencing current Indigenous culture, and the feminist narrative on that is too simplistic.
It is, you know, it's not a straightforward matter. You know, it is very complex. You know, so you've got the customary law on one hand that can be abused, but it's also used in a genuine way. And then on the other hand, you've got the trauma that's tracked down through the generations. There's there's alcohol problems, there's mental illness, and things like that are at the root of domestic violence as well. So we need to find some way to separate these things and clearly understand them,
and acknowledge the fact that all those issues, drug and alcohol abuse, mental illness and so on, that are, some of which is a consequence of this, displacement in your culture, are impacting on women as well as men, and are causing untold harm to children growing up witnessing it. We're just absolutely ignoring that. Phil, I'm really happy you joined me here today, and I think this is a very important issue we're exposing, and very brave of you to be willing to speak out about something that most people are too nervous to discuss.
Well, thank you. I mean, I felt compelled to get in touch with you in the first instance, and I know that when in the 70s and 80s, when I was a younger man, I mean, we could talk about things quite openly. And now it just seems to me that we're in an age where we're being shut down. And I think that we need to be able to have the opportunity to discuss these things openly and in a mature and sensible way. So I really appreciate being able to come along and talk about it from my perspective.
And people watching, anyone who'd like to talk to Phil about their views on this issue, I'm sure you'd be happy to have them get in touch with you.
Yeah, anytime at all.
Good. Thank you, everybody. Thanks everybody for supporting me on my YouTube channel. I've got growing numbers of subscribers, which is really exciting. If you'd like to support me financially, go to my donate page on my website. Thanks a lot.